I've been the most impressed by the fact that as a somewhat decentralized organization right now that has glaring leadership holes, that we haven't seen small bands of these potentially, Radwan forces. They're more elite fighters that are more capable in southern Lebanon that attain these or maintain these rocket launch
Mm.
positions in southern Lebanon. That we haven't seen them violating the ceasefire, firing on their own without approval from the
Yeah.
higher ups. So it's impressive to know that Hezbollah is maintaining, and I guess in some respect, their own credibility as a functioning organization by being able to maintain the ceasefire and not have any of these guys down in the field popping off these rockets.
Yeah.
They're on their part, they're largely holding.
How many rockets and missiles have to be fired before a ceasefire isn't a ceasefire anymore? Quite a lot, it seems. Israel has fired rockets into Lebanon, and Hezbollah has fired rockets at Israeli forces. But the White House spokesperson John Kirby said on Monday that, largely speaking, the ceasefire is holding. Let's talk again to Zach Anders, a journalist in Tel Aviv. Zach, morning to you.
Hey, good morning.
Uh, Could you say that, in your objective opinion, is the ceasefire largely holding? And can a ceasefire, you can't be a little bit pregnant, but maybe you can have largely holding ceasefire?
It really depends on how you look at these things and how I interpret these things. Israel, based on the text of the agreement, they have far more latitude to carry out what are listed in the agreement as preemptive action, military action against Hezbollah. But the ceasefire as a whole, if we don't have rockets firing into northern Israel by Hezbollah, now last night was a small exception. We had two projectiles. They were described to me as mortars, so men that are launching these grenades essentially into tubes, firing them at a pretty close range at a military position on northern Israel. Only two, no material damage to the base, no casualties, but the IDF responding in force. And they say they were going to do that, that they're going to try and keep the ceasefire intact by reminding Hezbollah that no matter what they do, if they're firing into northern Israel, that's not going to be accepted. We have not seen a red alarm since that moment. There has not been drones or long-range rockets fired into northern Israel. So on Hezbollah's part, the ceasefire largely is holding.
And what would be the motivation for a couple of small rockets towards Israel that could cause revenge, could cause action back, could threaten the ceasefire? Is it because Hezbollah is maybe not entirely a uniform organization? There may be people within it who don't necessarily agree with the ceasefire. And actually, the leaders on both sides are kind of aware of that and would probably write that into their own assessment of the matter, that you might get some squalling around the edges, but that can be ignored to a certain extent.
And that's the element to this, the calculation that I think fascinates me the most because Hezbollah has been degraded in its leadership structure. I mean, think back to the pagers and the radios.
Mm.
The men that were giving those orders are dead. The men that were receiving those orders had their hands blown off or have gaping wounds in their hips from the pagers and the radios. So structurally, Hezbollah as an organization historically has granted a lot of military capacity to those field commanders to be able to launch the rockets themselves. They don't need to, they're not like the US military, British special forces. They're not going to wait for their commander to give them an approval order that's gone down the chain of command multiple times before it finally reaches those men at the launch point. So I've been the most impressed by the fact that as a somewhat decentralized organization right now that has glaring leadership holes, that we haven't seen small bands of these potentially, Radwan forces. They're more elite fighters that are more capable in southern Lebanon that attain these or maintain these rocket launch
Mm.
positions in southern Lebanon. That we haven't seen them violating the ceasefire, firing on their own without approval from the
Yeah.
higher ups. So it's impressive to know that Hezbollah is maintaining, and I guess in some respect, their own credibility as a functioning organization by being able to maintain the ceasefire and not have any of these guys down in the field popping off these rockets.
Yeah.
They're on their part, they're largely holding. Now, I spoke with a senior IDF. We had a briefing just 2 days ago. This senior IDF source said, and even presented some evidence of Hezbollah rearming south of the Litani River in violation of the ceasefire agreement. So they're moving. We know they're moving back into, and you can see for yourself. There's video online of these convoys, these caravans of vehicles moving back into the ceasefire. Was once the ceasefire was announced, moving back into southern Lebanon, waving the Hezbollah flag and things like that. Does that make this, do they represent an armed wing, a militant wing of Hezbollah moving back into the region? Hard to be able to have enough evidence to say for sure. The IDF says there's enough evidence to
Yeah.
say for sure, but it's a very imperative moment. It's a very cautious moment, but what we saw last night, Israel responding very heavily. There's 9 fatalities reported at 2 airstrike positions, 3 other casualties. So that's the most over the course of this now 7-day ceasefire. That's the most concerning moment we've
Yeah.
had. But we wake up this morning, no rocket alarms. It's quiet in
It's
northern
still
Israel. So it appears to still be holding.
the ceasefire still holding. Really interesting stuff. Zach, great to speak to you as ever. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Zach Anders there. The ceasefire largely, there's an adverb for you, largely holding at the moment.
شو بدي اياه من الواحد